Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the National Press Club of Australia and today's Westpac address. My name is Sabra Lane. I'm the club's president. I'm also the presenter of the ABC radio program AM. Well, 20 years ago today, the Goods and Services Tax came into being, and I'm not sure that you actually had that in mind when you planned the launch of today's report. The New South Wales government does argue that it is time for another wave of economic transformation in Australia. It commissioned this report that is being launched today, the New South Wales Review of Federal Financial Relations. David Sadie chaired the panel. He will give us a speech shortly, and with me here on the stage is the New South Wales Treasurer, Dominic Perrottet, and also a panel member, Jane Holton. Mr Sadie will speak, and then we'll have an in-conversation style about some of the report's recommendations before throwing it open to the floor. If you're following us online, you can find us on Twitter. Our user handle is @PressClubAUST. Please join me in welcoming the Review Chairman, David Sadie.
Well, good afternoon, and Sabra, thanks very much for that very warm welcome. It's great to be back here and wanted to have an opportunity to talk around a subject like federal financial relations. We do want to talk around the Federation today, and specifically around the financial aspect of the relationship between state and Commonwealth. And I should say, this has been a very successful form of government for, 120 years. So I'm sure I'm not the only one who's stood up here at various times and talked around federation and about how we should reform it. And probably they're on this exact spot, saying that we should have some new form of federation and stop the blame game between the Commonwealth and the states, or something. Maybe they even talked around things like having a cooperative federalism or a new federalism. But we want to come here today to say that we think that over the last 20 or 30 years, very little has really changed. And we think that it is time for a change. And as Sabra said, it wasn't our intent to be on the 1st of July 2020, but it's 20 years since we introduced GST. But the politics of federation are difficult. Any change in our federal structures does require a real consensus at the national level, because there's many complex issues to consider, both political and constitutional, but also, financial. So it's, when you come to this, even though it is difficult, we think the conversation is very important in terms of what we were laying out. And today, as we, face the COVID-19 challenges, we really do need the Commonwealth and the states to be working together in a way that is in the betterment of all Australians. And I think we're already seeing that in many different ways, which is very encouraging. So it was, June last year when the Treasurer rang me and said, we'd like to do a review of federal financial relations. And I applaud him for doing it because it was a brave move. And he then asked me to work with a talented group of people who are mostly with me today. John Anderson, who's here, Bill English, who couldn't be here from New Zealand, John Fairbairn, who's caught in Victoria at the moment, couldn't travel, of course Jane Holton, and of course Anne Toomey. It was a great panel, and we had a lot of very good discussions about reviewing federal financial relations, and we were really focused on what real improvements we could make, and it was I think a very engaging set of conversations, and I think the report does sort of reflect some of that. Then it's interesting that in May this year the need for this review was further reinforced by the Prime Minister when he asked his new National Federation Reform Council to look at changing the way the Commonwealth and states and territories effectively and productively work together to address new areas of reform. So I think that we have some alignment for change, and I think it is now really upon us all to have the conversation. The challenges of federation are many and complex, and I'm sure many of you are aware of them. You hear about creeping centralisation, the increasing administrative burden, have all in their own way undermined what should be one of the most economically efficient forms of government. Our version of federalism has the Commonwealth with significant financial control, and in a way, the states have developed a degree of what we call learned financial dependency. We don't think this is healthy. We don't think it's sustainable, and the way our federation was designed was not that way. So we think that without reform, the states are going to find it very difficult to face an increasing challenge in funding for the essential services that they provide, namely health, education, and infrastructure. So we need to get this right. While the Federation is definitely not broken, both the Federation and the tax system that it supports can certainly be made to function more effectively, and we think more aligned. So I hope that this review of the Federation will lead to some reform, and not what many reforms have led to, which is more frustration. In fact, as we've reflected on this, we do have some optimism for this reform. Let me just try to explain why. Firstly, we have the lessons from the last 6 months where we've seen the Federation work at its best and maybe at not its optimum. On the one hand, we have seen the Federation work less optimally through the bushfires, with blurred responsibilities and poor accountability for each tier of government, leading to confusion and to a degree of blame shifting. And of course, that is subject to an inquiry at the moment. And then on the other hand, we've seen the Federation work at its very best. The way the Commonwealth and the states have worked cooperatively together and through the new, now permanent National Cabinet on COVID-19, I think has been impressive, and I'm delighted to say that it is going to continue on. There is no doubt that our Federation has helped to engender a sense of, I think, greater mutual trust between the states and the Commonwealth, because we've had a common purpose, and that common purpose is very important. Secondly, we are no longer talking in the abstract about the long-term implications of delaying reform of federal financial relations. When we started this review in June, we were looking out over a decade in terms of the fiscal gap that the state was looking at, and it was sort of a future issue. Of course, now it has become a reality. After 3 decades of great economic performance, that is officially over, and we have very real issues that we as a nation need to stare into. So that is why this issue can no longer be confined to bipartisan politics. It needs to be us all working together to try to determine what is in the best interest of the state and of our nation. As I mentioned, the Prime Minister has recognised this. He said Federation and tax system reform are now a critical component of the nation's pathway to recovery. A critical component of the nation's pathway to recovery. This means that we have an opportunity to pursue Commonwealth-state relations that we think can do 3 things. Firstly, it's got to support economic recovery, because that is what is so essential at the moment, and it needs to support households and businesses in that rebound process. Secondly, we need to sustainably fund essential services and infrastructure into the future, something that the New South Wales has done exceptionally well, but it needs to continue to do that so that we have a good quality of life in our state. And also, we need to restore the state's financial capacity in helping them respond to future crises, because this is just one event and there will be others in the future. So we changed the title of our report, which had been around federal financial relations, to the title of Supporting the Road to Recovery, because that's what we think it is. And we lay out 15 recommendations, and I'm just going to cover a few of those very briefly. There were some principles that we applied too, because it was important we had principles as we looked at some of the challenges. We wanted to keep taxes as low as possible, but we felt that we had to change the tax mix so that it was more efficient, predictable and resilient, because that is what we need going forward. We also sought to make federal financial relations simpler and focused on outcomes and not process. And so often we see that process becomes the enemy of good outcomes. And to this end, we're suggesting that our Commonwealth state funding agreements be reviewed with the goal of clarifying roles and responsibilities and reducing duplication and bureaucracy. And we think it is timely to do another review of roles and responsibilities. The Prime Minister has again rightly tasked the state treasurers already with this assignment. We also recommended that taxes need to be addressed, the ones that are inefficient, unfair, that have a shrinking base or perverse impact on citizens. And when you look at the taxes today, some of them have unintentionally arrived at that point. And we need to replace them with taxes that are simple, broad-based and equitable. So what are we specifically recommending for New South Wales? Well, the first one is that we do strongly recommend that they should use the best lever they've got, which is land. You know, effectively replacing stamp duties with a broad-based land tax over a long, equitable transition period, because we think it can't happen overnight. We do think that there should be a phase out of transfer duties and taxes on insurance because they are not effective. And also they don't, in New South Wales, effectively address the whole base. We do think that the New South Wales should work with the other states to address the hollowing out and complexity of payroll tax, which is a good tax, but it has become very convoluted across each state. We have additionally suggested that New South Wales could pilot a personal income tax sharing model. Now, what we're trying to get to here is get away from tied grants to a simpler process that still allows the Commonwealth to direct in some way the state, but it's not the 50 that we have in New South Wales today. And then there are several other areas where we think Commonwealth and state cooperation is critical. And I do want to mention the GST today on our 20th anniversary. I want to be clear about it because it is subject to a lot of misinterpretation when GST, because GST is a difficult thing to talk about. But it is important to understand it is one of our most effective taxes, and it has a relatively low economic cost. But we definitely do not use it as much as many other nations. As a share of GDP, GST revenues are the third lowest of all OECD countries, leaving us reliant on higher income taxes and complex funding agreements to fund frontline services and infrastructure. The GST provides about 12% of tax revenue in Australia, whereas someone like New Zealand, it is 30% of their broad-based tax base. So quite different. And as a consumption patterns have shifted, growth in the GST revenue pool is waning. And there's been a number of reports that have said that. And that's just adding to this fiscal gap at the state level. The Commonwealth and states need, or should, or can, explore options to increase the rate of GST or broaden its base. We were not specific about which one should be looked at, but we do think it's time to have a look at what makes sense for this nation. And I would say I think it needs to be looked at as a total package, not necessarily just as the GST. So, despite the obvious political challenges that accompany any talk around the GST, we think that it is a good time to look at it because we think that there is a consensus building and it would be timely to pull it out and have a look at it. So, as we've gone around and talked to various people, we've felt that the momentum for change is strong. And it's not just from a few individual leaders. It's from a broad base across the sector, business, academics, and in the community. And for the first time in many years, it appears that we have the mechanisms to deliver quite genuine reform through the National Cabinet, the National Federation Reform Council, and also the Council on Federal Financial Relations. So it's a good opportunity and we need to grab it. So in concluding, we're under no illusion that this is difficult, and we may not have all the answers, but if we start the conversation, we can then move forward. And it's going to need a change on all sides. I think the states have got to step up and shoulder their burden along the way, and also the Commonwealth needs to look at the answer is not centralisation to everything, but it's finding the common ground where we can build a consistent and sustainable way forward. But it is going to require a new level of cooperation, both at the political level and at the public servant level. So there is a mandate for change and a great opportunity for us to move this country forward, and I think it's worth a go. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Sadie. Now, before we kick off a panel discussion here, I want to come to one of the panel members, John Anderson. On the point about GST and the political difficulties involved, you were involved in that 1998 election campaign which argued for a GST, which John Howard had argued would never ever happen, and he went to an election arguing for a mandate. You succeeded in that election, but the majority was whittled back from 44 seats to 12, I think, on memory, and that was achieved in an era where there wasn't 24/7 media coverage and there wasn't social media. How would you go about achieving a sort of major change, not only with GST, but other things that we're talking about here, congestion, possibly congestion tax, road user charges? How would you go about that in the current environment?
Sabra, thank you, and to my colleagues and to the New South Wales Treasurer and friends, good to be here. A long time since I was here, and the last time I spoke here I was pushed off the front page by another event, and that might happen today as well up on the hill, but what we're talking about is very important. My opening comment would be this. We face a bewildering range of internal and external challenges as a nation. We will not resolve any of them satisfactorily without a massive improvement in the public debate. You can't get good public policy out of a bad or a truncated or a distorted debate that is not evidence-based. So the challenge is really before us, and it says something of enormous significance that we are today celebrating no less than 20 years since we had a major taxation reform in Australia. So the issue is firstly cultural, not simply one of policy. Are we capable of as a people, of pulling together in the face of the challenges, external and internal, that confront us as a nation, and of acting in our own best interests? Because so often we manage to collectively shoot ourselves in the foot by failing to enact good policy. So this is very timely. I think I would take the view that it will, of course, as you imply, be very difficult. It was very difficult last time round. We almost lost the 1998 election, although I personally sometimes think we won it precisely because we were fighting for something we deeply believed in. We only just won it, but we might have lost it if we hadn't been fighting for something that we believed in, even though the Australian people didn't particularly want a GST at the time. And that wasn't the end of the battle. Brian Harradine, who was a man of some honour, I have to say, decided he couldn't support the GST. We were then reliant on the Democrats. And I've never said this before publicly, but I think Meg Lees deserves enormous credit for seeking to act in the national interest in a way that antagonised her own base and led to very difficult circumstances for her party. So we need to wake up. We really do. Everyone knows that we need to mount an enormous policy response to the challenges that confront us. Taxation is one of us. And David has mentioned, of course, that alluded to the fact that all taxes have some impact on economic activity. Some have greater impact than others. and you want to go for the efficient ones. We argue in this that there should not be an increase in the tax burden coming out of COVID-19, but we need to do taxation better. Are we capable of doing it? Sabra, it's a good question. I think it's an open question. But as a proud Australian concerned for my children and my grandchildren, we have to do it better. Now, to the practicalities, when he was first asked about this, and I actually think so far the debate about this is, and everyone knows what we've been doing, what we've been talking about, has been relatively calm and reasoned. Maybe COVID-19 is telling us, and maybe we're recognising we need to be more responsible and more mature in this country. But it was very interesting that there hasn't been mass hysteria. When the Treasurer was asked about the GST, he made a very interesting and telling comment. He said, the Commonwealth is not seeking a mandate for change. Well, by implication then, if we need to change, who should? The people who benefit, most of all, from the GST. It's the states. It's become a state tax, although it's there because of Commonwealth legislation. So my argument here would be that the states, and I compliment the New South Wales Treasurer, a competent Treasurer from a well-run state, looking into the future, recognising that we must prepare ourselves for the future. They need to get together. They need to do the evidence. We argue that here too. Proper, perhaps, Commonwealth and state intergenerational reports so that we know what is coming. We have the evidence. We can say to people, we have to change if we're to fund the educational and the health services and so forth that you want. This has to be part of the mix. And that, of course, let's talk the raw politics, will mean that the Labor Party, which opposes the GST, always has, will oppose increases. We need the state treasurers to respond to what Paddy McGuinness said, the late Paddy McGuinness said, when we were promoting a GST all those years ago. The debate should not be about whether or not we have a GST, in this case whether we have a whole-scale reform. It should be about how best to do it. This is nothing short of a test of our national maturity. All I can say is that for our children's sake, let's hope this time we can rise above what we've seen in recent years into a better space.
Thank you, Mr Anderson. Okay, the segue to that is to you, Dominique Perrottet. You've only just received this report. What next, and how are you going to talk with your Labor Treasurer colleagues about what to do here, whether there is a united front?
Yeah, Sabra, obviously there's a lot in this. There's a smorgasbord of reform, and I think what's important, with obviously on the 20th anniversary of the GST, there's discussion about whether we should increase it, broaden it, is this a tax hike? My overarching principle is that, as John has said, we should have a lower tax burden, a fairer tax burden, and a smarter tax system that's fit for the 21st century. And a lot of the taxes, particularly the state taxes that we rely upon, are inefficient, meaning they stifle economic and jobs growth. So there is no more apt time for us as a nation to be having a mature discussion around what's the best mix that lowers the burden, that drives economic and jobs growth for future prosperity of our country. And reform is not an end to itself. It's ultimately about people and providing a system that enables not just us, but as John has pointed out, our kids to have a better life and to drive future prosperity. So there's a lot in this, whether that's tax changes, whether that's the division of federal and state responsibilities that need to be addressed to improve service delivery. But in terms of how do we move forward, one of the great things that we've set up recently between state treasurers has been a board of treasurers where across party lines, Labor and Liberals, we've become the best of frenemies. We've worked together in what we believe is in the best interests of the country. And the reality is, when it comes to the Federation, it shouldn't just be the Commonwealth that leads that discussion. The states shouldn't just be passengers in relation to reform. We should be driving opportunities for reform agenda to the federal government. So with that spirit of cooperation that I think we have at a political level, but as David's pointed out, also I think that's where the public are too. I think the 30 years of economic prosperity that we've had has come off the back of the Hawke-Keating, Howard Costello reforms, and it's now really an opportunity for us to think about, do we manage the status quo, or do we bring our system forward to set up our state and country for future success?
Jane Holton, I'm interested in your views on this. The report was not commissioned when COVID was around. now that we've got COVID here, we've seen shutdowns right across Australia, businesses close. There's been a lot of talk about people concerned about the long-term effects on younger Australians who will be paying this off. Is there, in your view, the social compact that now is around this, how important is that?
I think it's fundamental. I've said previously, I think there is an implicit agreement that we as older generations have effectively entered into with younger people. We have closed down huge parts of our economy in order to protect the elderly, the vulnerable, etc., and that is coming at a price. And we know from our younger friends, our children, etc., that many of them are finding this extremely difficult. It's impacting their longer-term prospects. And so I think David talked about this and the Treasurer's talked about this, essentially what we're now focusing on is how do we set up for success our economy, our society, and governments, and in fact all of us have a role to play in that. So if you think about it, what is the best thing that we can do to actually ensure that our kids have the best chance of being able to participate in social and economic life in a way that basically gives them the best chance? And so I think it is a timely point, and David made this point. When we started talking about that, we were looking over the horizon and we were looking at sort of the erosion of the GST base and saying, well, you know, in a few years' time, that's not great now, but it's going to be pretty challenging out there. Well, guess what? We're there now. And I think that's the point. The point at which you are at a cliff, a precipice where things are very difficult. It's incumbent on us to say, how could we make not only this a survival exercise, how can we make it an improvement exercise? And the ideas that are in here, we haven't designed all of them to the last dot and comma because there's a lot of work to be done here. But we think there are some ideas in here that will actually give people a good start on that discussion.
David Sadie, former Chief Executive of Telstra, current Chair of CSIRO, respected businessman. There's been a lot of MPs up the hill will say that they've proposed controversial things in the past that business have advocated for, and when the public time has come to argue the case, business has scattered to the winds and has been nowhere to be seen. How important, in your view, will it be for business to argue the case for change, if there is common agreement?
Well, I think it's very important. I mean, business needs to be an active, participant, but an equal participant with government and with the academic community. And I think it's very important for the nation. Just coming back to some of your questions, Sabra, I mean, there's no question we have enormous challenges right here now. I mean, 3.3 million people on JobKeeper, 1.6 on JobSeeker. We care passionately. We've got to look after these people and help through the transition. But at the same time, we need to think the next decade and the next 2 decades. And that's what's so difficult in this conversation. Because if we keep going the way we are, then we will not be able to provide the quality of life, the quality of education and health that our people in Australia deserve. So this is the fine balance, and business needs to be an active part of that conversation. And I've got to say, I think that through the last 2 to 3 months, I've seen a wonderful dialogue between, Commonwealth public servants dealing with business, with the academic community, same in the States. I've seen people come together in a way that I've not seen them in my 30-odd years of business. So it's very important. Now, will we get absolute agreement on every item? You know we won't. But in the conversation, we will go forward, and that's what's so important. And I think John said that, and we just have not having these open, transparent conversations the way that I think we need to, and that's why I think this report's so important.
Dominic Perrottet, there will be the temptation for some to run straight away and say that this is, for some things, a great big new tax on X, great big new tax on your car.
Yeah.
That is going to be a big temptation. How do you reckon with the other side to avoid the temptation to do that and to have a considered conversation?
Well, I think the public's up for it, and I think the maturity in the public probably is better than where politics is to some degree. I mean, if you go back to 1983 to 2007, you had 3 prime ministers during that period of time. Since then, you've had twice the prime ministers in half the time, and that political instability, I think, leads to policy paralysis. Whereas I think if you're doing what's right and you've got some clear principles, I think John Howard spoke this morning in relation to the GST, where he said, if you're acting in the national interest and you look after those who are most vulnerable, then you can bring the community with you. And I think, yes, it's a challenge, but if we can have that cooperation, not just across political lines, but between the state and federal governments, I believe there's never been a better opportunity to achieve substantive reform that's in the national interest that will improve people's lives. So if you're doing what's right, I think that's the good starting point. But there's no doubt there'll always be those who say, no, you can't. But if we have a bit more of yes, you can, I think we'll get there.
All right, we're going to come to questions in a tick. What is the timetable now? What have you got in mind?
Well, I think what's been incredibly pleasing is the constructive discussions with the federal government. The Prime Minister recently, through the Federal Treasurer, has appointed the Federal State Treasurers to work on deregulation and tax reform. So I think there is a real appetite for that across the political divide. So obviously, from a state government perspective, we'll consider the recommendations that are in this report, and I'll be certainly working with my state and territory counterparts in terms of where can we find common ground. I think a lot of the reform initiatives that are in this are best tackled in a unified way, with states and territories working with the Commonwealth. But there are other ones that the states can go alone. And as David has said, we're not all going to agree on absolutely everything. But if we can find common ground, I think there's a fair bit in this report that we can pick up and take forward. And so whether it's our state, this is the draft report. I expect a final report later in the year, and our government will respond to it. And I think these are the ideas that we will immediately, though, bring into a national discussion with the Federal Treasurer.
Excellent. John Keogh.
Thank you, Treasurer, and thank you, Jane, and also David. Congratulations on the report. Well done for commissioning it. I think it's brave. I think a lot of economists would agree that shifting from a stamp duty to land tax is a bit of a no-brainer, same with broadening the GST. But, Treasurer, some of your federal colleagues point out on the Hill that they're not sure if you're going to have the courage to walk the talk on, for example, telling homeowners in New South Wales that they're going to pay an annual land tax, given that New South Wales couldn't push through a relatively simple emergency services levy, which is sort of a softer version of a fully fledged land tax. How are you going to walk the talk to not only convince the voters in New South Wales, but also other state treasurers and premiers and your own cabinet to get some of these reforms through?
Well, John, it's a good question. I mean, I'd say from the outset, we don't just have an opportunity to do this. In light of where we sit economically and through this pandemic, we have an obligation to make these changes. And I think we're in a very different environment than we were before. I accept the federal government's view in relation to the GST, particularly where they say, well, it's all well and good for the states who putting their hand out. I think Paul Keating once said, don't get between a state premier and a bucket of cash. So that's probably still true today. They could argue that it's all care, no responsibility, we'll take the political risk. But it shouldn't be about that. It should be working together on where are the opportunities, and whether it's competition payments where we can work together across federal lines to achieve these reforms. In relation to a stamp duty particularly, I think if you look at all of the taxes that are in this review, it's by far the most inefficient tax, and it's grown since the 1850s, and it's just become an impediment for transactions to occur, and it stifles economic and jobs growth for all states right across the nation. And it's time, I think, that we did something about it. Now, my view in relation to that is that there's options that have been put here, and I think one of the interesting options, the first time it's been put through a report, is providing people choice. As a Liberal, I believe in lower taxes that ease the burden but grow the economy, and that provides opportunity and prosperity for not just for us but for future generations to come. So putting these ideas out there and having a mature discussion around them, I think we can bring the community with us on that journey. This is an independent review. These are areas that I think governments have flirted with for some time. But I think there's a real sense now that we can work across political lines, and that might not occur in our own state jurisdictions, but it may occur with Labor governments working with Liberal governments to do what's right. And that's where I think the real opportunity for bipartisanship lies.
Patrick Cummins.
Well, thanks very much, Treasurer. I have a question around stamp duty as well. In the absence of GST reform, let's say that's a longer-term project, presumably there'll be some financial hit to state earnings as a result of this transition to a land tax, if it happens. Have you or will you ask the federal government to help you with that transition to something like a more efficient land tax?
Look, I have very constructive discussions with the Federal Treasurer around these issues, and my view has been, it's not just about the finance. Let's just take a step back. What's most I think important for us as treasurers of state and federal jurisdictions right now is putting the economy before the budget. And our budget positions will improve over time if our economy grows and people are in work. And I can say right across the board that would be our number one focus. Now, in terms of reaching agreements on a financial basis, well, states can, in some of these areas, go alone. We can, and in many instances we should. I think, though, not just from a financial perspective would it be beneficial to work with the Commonwealth Government, but also I think in terms of a bipartisanship that shows national unity. I think that would also be important as part of some of the reforms that are set out in this paper. In the past, we've had competition payments from the federal level to, encourage states to reform. More recently, we had the asset recycling incentive, which New South Wales certainly received its lion's share of. I mean, look, in many ways, we would go on our own and do it ourselves. But I think working together, we can achieve more. But there will also need to be changes. I mean, some of the reforms you talk about, the way the GST is structured, I think Tim Pallas, the Victorian Treasurer, made this point very recently, that some of the challenges we have with the GST is that if states were to embark on some of these reforms, they would be penalised in GST distributions. So whether it comes through financial support from the federal government, in addition to that, what you would need to look at are where are there disincentives for states to reform, and I think the way the GST is distributed would need to be looked at as part of that broader process.
Shane Wright.
Welcome to the territory which has embarked on change to stamp duty. Yes, there's a different few views up on the hill about just what that's doing. I just wanted to come to you, Treasurer, just your commentary about the GST and its the way it's carved up, because the PC report that was put in place, the recommendations of that weren't actually adopted by then Treasurer Scott Morrison. He came up with his own model, and from my memory, New South Wales wanted a per capita arrangement and moved back to that. When you say you've got to look at HFE and the Grants Commission, are you saying, well, we need to go back to that, and have you told Ben Wyatt of your plan?
Well, I would say one of the great aspects has been the cooperation between the state and territory treasurers, even though we don't necessarily... If you're going to choose one area that we're going to struggle to agree on, it's going to be the GST. I mean, from my perspective as treasurer of the largest state in the country, we've argued for a per capita basis, I think, since the commencement of the GST. But we also believe we have an obligation to support the smaller states. Around that time when that PC report came out, my view was that if those recommendations were adopted, you'd be moving much closer to a system that encouraged states to reform, not penalise them. And I think that's where the Commission was going in relation to those recommendations. And it's set out in this report as well that if a state was to embark on, for example, abolishing stamp duty, we would receive less in the distributions of GST because we'd be foregoing the capacity to raise revenue on a lever that was available to us. So, look, we may not always agree on the states may struggle in that space, but I think we can agree on that competition is good, that we should have a system that encourages growth, that encourages states to look at better ways and innovative ways of doing things, and work through from there. But yeah, look, I completely accept that with Western Australia and the changes they made there. I mean, I wasn't a huge fan at the time of putting a floor in, and I think that if you look at the way that the volatility of the Western Australian economy. You know, when the mining boom was on, they should have saved some of those funds. They should have set up a sovereign wealth fund to ensure that when the downturn came, they were in a stronger position. In essence, we've created a system now that when that boom comes again, it's going to be probably Victoria and New South Wales that are there to support the smaller states. You know, we could talk all day about some of the challenges of the distribution of the GST, and I think in terms of the calculation, there's probably one person in this entire country that knows all the ins and outs about how it's all put together. But what's most important, I think, today and going forward is to work out what we can find unity on, and I think you'll find there's a much greater capacity now than ever before through the Board of State Treasurers for states to agree on more things that can help drive national reform for the better.
Sabra, can I be sneaky? Just a supplementary. You talk about competition amongst the states, but the recommendation is to effectively unify payroll tax. And I read that, I thought Joe Bjelke-Petersen will be turning in his grave about competitive federalism. Why not allow states to have set different rates and compete on payroll tax?
Yeah. So, I mean, this is obviously the government will consider this report. It's an interesting point that came out on payroll tax because I think in some areas, I mean, today in our state, we've increased the payroll tax threshold to $1 million. And I think the point that comes through this review is that many states end up competing and diminishing that tax base. Now, I personally believe that payroll tax is a tax on labour, but you've got a situation between our friends up to the north and Victoria to the south that you have different tax rates right across the border. That in certain circumstances, I think there is an argument for greater unity and uniformity in that space so you can improve the efficiency. Yeah. But I think the report also goes to not just locking in payroll tax, but how could you look at a more efficient way of taxing to receive that, well, in our case, $9 billion of revenue in New South Wales.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Treasurer. By the way, I should say the engagement of the other states for this process has been quite remarkable. I mean, the Treasurer mentions the Board of Treasurers. I mean, I think I've presented twice to there, and I've talked to them, and there's been a lot of engagement, and with the Commonwealth as well. I mean, they're not saying they agree with everything, but they're saying, hey, let's talk about it, let's engage, put the issue on the table. So, hey, that's a good first step, and I'm not sure that's happened before. So, all credit to the Treasurer.
Before we come to the next question, Jane Holton, I'm interested in your view on this. If there is no change, if it's the status quo, what happens? And I'm also interested in the what happens question, particularly through the health lens. Our health departments right around Australia have performed very, very well during COVID. If there is no change to funding, what happens to health systems around Australia?
Well, if we accept, and I think the numbers are incontrovertible, that the base of the GST is shrinking, which by definition means that source of revenue to underpin needed and really fundamental services in our community, that will shrink. And I think one of the challenges we have here is we have a sort of an argument of diminishing returns. So we'll start arguing about whether or not we can spend, that $500,000 to refurbish something in an emergency department. And we'll get into this sort of very micro level of salami slicing, whereas in fact what we should be talking about is how do we deliver the best quality services to citizens right around the country. Be you in Borroloola or Bourke, or a suburb of a major city, you should have, in a wealthy country, the right to expect a good quality of service. So I think one of the challenges we have, and I think this is the point that the report makes, is we need a level of confidence about revenue to underpin and to be delivered in the most economically efficient way to underpin what as Australians we regard as being something which is fundamental to life in this country, which is a good quality of service. And it's just that simple.
Katina Curtis.
Thanks, Treasurer. I noted that you said earlier that this shouldn't be a question. This should be a question about working together on GST reform. But I guess the political reality is what it is. There will be some pain. Someone will have to wear it. So, what could you, as a state government, offer to the Commonwealth to share that political pain?
Well, when it comes to some of these challenging reforms, that's why I think we should be doing those, working on these reforms together. And I think there's certainly that view from Josh Frydenberg. I think the discussions that I've had with him, I think have been incredibly constructive in a desire and will to improve the system for the better. Yeah, there are always political challenges with reform, and as I said just earlier, John Howard's point this morning was exactly right. If you can look after the most vulnerable people, let's make sure that no one's worse off. Does that make some of the change cost more to the states and to the territory budgets? Yes, yes, it will. But we're at a point in time right now where everything that we do should be focused on driving economic growth, driving jobs growth, and future prosperity for our state and nation. And that's why I think this report's important, because some have said, well, you know, the Commonwealth should be leading this. Well, I believe the states have an incredibly important role, particularly when you look through this, that a lot of the areas are wholly located within the states. So they are politically challenging. We do live in a political environment where it's easy to say no and run scare campaigns. But as I said, if you're doing what's right, it's going to be in the best interests of the states. If the states go well, the country goes well, and we have, I think, a once in a 100-year opportunity now. When we started this, it was probably a bit before its time, and whereas I think where we sit now, there's a real sense, not just in amongst the politicians, but amongst people right across the country, in business, in media as well, that this is the right thing to do to tackle these challenges. And with that support, I believe we can make a change for the better.
David, Sadie, take us through this idea of a congestion cordon for the Sydney CBD, and whether you think that would also be perhaps examined in other CBDs like Melbourne or Brisbane.
Well, we thought we should put it in there. I mean, we were really looking at the bigger issue of the fuel excise tax going away, and obviously there's a big change in terms of, potentially going to electric and just the whole balance there. Yeah, look, we've had a lot of discussion on the congestion tax. Look, it's been introduced in a number of cities around the world, and I know there's different views. Would like to say that there's any unanimity on this one, but I think that cities need to be livable, and if we can find ways that we can make them more accessible, that would be great. And if that's a way of just incenting that and raise a little bit of revenue along the way, that's okay for me. But is that one going to be a bestseller? I'm not sure, Sandra. I think it might be.
Does that go, if you're looking at congestion taxes, are you looking at also hand in hand, perhaps some of that revenue going to improving public transport, more cycleways, that kind of thing?
I mean, New South Wales is a wonderful example of a reformed public transport environment that is really great. I'm a public transport user now as well, and I tell you, it's pretty efficient getting in from the North Shore. So, I think that we've got to look at that whole balance. And then, look, I mean, I know that, and I am a technologist, there's a lot of discussion around self-driving cars. I'm afraid I think that's a way away. And the big question is, will it put more cars on the road or less as people are sending off, to pick up their pizza? So, look, I think that one needs a lot more thinking, but we do need to put it on the table and think about it as we go forward. But we are a big believer in public transport.
Jennifer Duke.
Thank you so much for taking my question. Look, I was curious to know if you don't get buy-in from the federal government, is that the end of stamp duty reform, or is there a longer-term plan, and what's the timeline for that, if so?
Look, it's a great question. First of all, I'm incredibly optimistic we will have buy-in from the federal government, and they have indicated, I think, strong interest in driving tax reform and federation reform. And as I said earlier, they've put it on the state and territory and the federal treasurer to work through those areas. So they've certainly advanced it, and we are willing to help them on their tax reform journey. I'd also say that a lot of those areas within this report can be tackled wholly within state jurisdictions. So I accept the GST is something that the federal government needs to drive, to which the states may receive the benefit. But let's just remember, the states receive the benefit, but states doing well, the country does well. But there are many in here that I think the states can go alone. As the federal treasurer has said, we have our own strong balance sheets that we can embark on reform to drive economic growth within our own fiscal constraints. At a time where I think states can borrow at incredibly low rates, there is a real opportunity now, as I said, to put the economy first. It's just not just the opportunity here to do this. I think we all have an obligation, and there's a strong will from all the state treasurers, Labor and Liberal, to achieve some change. We may disagree on where are the best areas to tackle first. I think giving autonomy to states to go on their own and go down their own path that they think best suits their needs, because every state jurisdiction is unique. And that's why I think setting something at a federal level where states can be financially supported for choosing their own measures of productivity reform that best suit their needs, I think will set us up for success. But one of the great things about Australia, we're the lucky country, but if we don't reform, that luck may not last forever.
Tom Connell.
Tom Connell from Sky News. Treasurer, not wanting to cast a pall on the constructive discussions that are happening, it seems incredibly unlikely the federal government will be campaigning for an increase to the GST, or there'll be all the states and territories united. Is there any way of New South Wales going about its own consumption tax? And if there is a way, would there be any inclination?
Look, there's a lot in this report, and obviously GST has really taken over the course of the discussions, given the anniversary was today, which I can tell you was completely unintentional. But one of the interesting aspects in this report that hasn't had much coverage, but David spoke to it, was this idea of income tax sharing. And so GST, obviously, I think is a difficult area for the states to embark on in isolation. But the idea that we have all of these tied agreements between the Commonwealth and the states, I think we've got 50 in New South Wales. 24 of them are worth less than $5 million. So the time and effort that must go into the preparation and the bureaucracy that sits behind all these tied grants, if you somehow quantified what that amount was and gave the states a percentage of that as part of what they generate in income tax, you would encourage over time the encouragement for states to have jobs growth policies, economic growth policies that would obviously increase that share over time. So the challenge in that report is, I think, the tied grants and giving greater autonomy and flexibility to states, I think, is important. The federal government might think otherwise and say, well, hold on a second, if we're going to provide funding to the states, we want to have some buy-in in terms of how you spend that money. But I think, our Premier has spoken about dynamic federalism. I think being able to reform all of these agreements, I think, is necessary. And the other aspect off the back of it that hasn't really been spoken about much today, because the tax, I think, overtakes the discussion, but also the division of responsibilities between the state and federal governments. I mean, we have a situation today where the states run preschools, the Commonwealth runs childcare. You've got universities run by the federal government in the main and the states running skills. You've got a health system which the states kind of run against the federal system. The efficiencies and better service delivery we could actually generate by getting all of these ideas on the table and looking at those division of responsibilities, I think, is incredibly important, and now's a great time to do it. But no, GST, I think, would be very hard for a state to go alone on. But the income tax sharing thing, I think, is something that certainly should be looked at on a revenue-neutral basis from where we sit today. Get rid of these intertwined, tight agreements, and get to a much simpler and more efficient system that's going to improve service delivery right across the board.
On that point about sharing of personal income tax, the Prime Minister did argue that any future reform should make the boat go faster. How does that make the boat go faster, Jane and David?
Well, I mean, I think the Treasurer has just indicated that the opportunity to actually streamline administration and then the delivery of service, and it is the case, and I have wasted personally a vast amount of shoe leather in my career arguing the toss on dotting the I's and crossing the T's on intergovernmental agreements. And I would concur, well, I'm a signatory to this report, and I would completely concur that for very small amounts of money, it is worth the overhead. And if we're on about reducing the overhead, the drag on improved service delivery and on our economy more broadly, I would absolutely argue that this makes the boat go faster.
David Sadie?
Well, I'd agree. I mean, it is... by the time you get sort of five meetings, you've probably spent $2 million already, and so it's a bit ridiculous. And look, I understand if the Commonwealth or a minister's wanting to incentivise the state to do something, that there's a desire to sort of put in a structure, but there's better ways to do it. I mean, if for the minister, Minister Andrews in the CSRO, she writes me a letter every year and says, David, this is what I want you to do. And I duly reply, and then it's done. And so there's lots of different ways to do it. So we've just created a bureaucratic process which does not deliver good outcomes. So I think that's an easy one. The GST is difficult, I understand.
Tim Shaw.
Thanks, Barbara. Tim Shaw, Director of the National Press Club. Thank you all for being here today. Treasurer Perrottet, when we look at the net sum game of the possibility of broadening the GST or to increase it, could you wrap some numbers around it from a New South Wales perspective? What would the cost be to a New South Wales household on the basis of the broadening of the tax to an increase of the tax?
Well, obviously you've seen at the GST level at the moment, you've gone from about 60% down to 55% in terms of what's covered. If you broaden nationally, if you broaden the GST, I think you're about $24 billion, and from a raising it to be around $33 billion. But what I would, I think we're early days here in terms of looking at these issues, and I think what's most important in this report is that it talks to the principles of what we could actually do in circumstances with a diminishing tax base and having a lower tax base that actually will drive economic growth. So what I wouldn't want to see, particularly in my state, is households being obviously charged more and being less out of pocket, particularly in circumstances of the economic challenge we face ourselves in. And that's why this is all about what is the best mix of taxes that lowers the burden overall, that removes those inefficient taxes that stifle jobs and economic growth in our state and across the country. And that's why it's all got to be on the table. I mean, this report deals with things in isolation, but also then connects them to, well, you could broaden the GST, you could increase the GST, but if you did that, you do it at a point in time which would also reduce those other taxes like payroll taxes, like stamp duties, that also provide significant costs to households right across the state. But I think, to go back to John Howard's point, any changes that you made in this situation would need to lower the tax burden and the household burden that people would face across our state. But it's a discussion we need to have. But what you don't want to have is the conversation that I think you see when reports like this get released, that this is somehow a cash grab for governments. No, it should not be. It's about driving economic growth and reducing the tax burden on all our citizens that's most important, that will, I think, take our country forward.
Thank you. And maybe, Treasurer, if Bill English was here, he would channel the New Zealand experience, which was, it's a basket of taxes you need to balance. As they reduced income tax, they put more money in people's pocket as they put in the GST. So it's a balancing act, and I think that's what needs to be thought through. And we're not saying that is the answer, but it's that holistic approach you need to look at. Yeah.
Just before we go to the final question, a challenge out of 10, getting all states and territories on board and a compliant Senate.
On what?
If you look for GST changes.
I'd say this environment, we've got a very strong chance, Sabra, but 8 out of 10. But it's got to be done in a way where the states see the benefit of the reduction in taxes that will come from it. And there's never been a better time, I believe, for this change to occur. But the Senate is also there, and we learnt this. Someone raised earlier the changes that were made to the GST recently. Well, the senators are there not to represent their political party. The senators are there to represent their state, first and foremost. That is the structure of our federation. That is the structure of the Senate. And what gave me great hope in the most recent change to the GST at a federal level is that we urged, and I certainly urged my Liberal senators, which maybe didn't go down so well, that their prima facie obligation is to represent the people of New South Wales in the Senate, not the Liberal Party.
Steve Lewis.
Steve Lewis, Director of the National Press Club, former reporter on GST. Could I ask you, Mr Perrottet, on another hot-button issue, not the GST but China. A couple of hours ago, Prime Minister Morrison announced a big package on defence. It was aimed squarely at the rise of China in the Pacific in our region. We've seen that debate on China really polarised. We've seen a lot of criticism of Victoria over signing up to Belt Road. Are you worried, as Treasurer of the largest state, are you worried about repercussions from Beijing? Has the debate in Australia gone too far? And are you hearing from Chinese investors, Chinese government, that they are going to close off investment in New South Wales, Australia. Are you concerned that the debate's gone too far?
No, I'm not concerned, Steve. I think we need to have a constructive discussion around these areas, and there's no doubt we're going to be in a post-pandemic world. When it comes to international relations, it's going to be a more challenging time and a more unstable time than we've seen in the past. But for our state, I mean, we haven't taken the Victorian approach, but in our state, China remains an incredibly important trading partner. Whether that's through tourism, whether that's through international education. It's one of our most significant service exports, and we want to maintain that strong relationship going forward. So it's a challenge for our state, it's a challenge for our nation, and it's going to be a very different and uncertain world going forward. But as long as the public commentary remains constructive and we act in the national interest, that's first and foremost, and the Prime Minister's announcement today goes to that. That the number one responsibility of the federal government is to protect its citizens and the defence of the country. But at the same time going forward, China is one of our great trading partners, our great friends, and we need to maintain that relationship going forward. Does that mean times are always easy in relation to our relationships in respect of our trading partners? Not always, and this is a challenge for us, but I believe we'll get through it. I mean, what will be a more difficult world post this pandemic.
Everybody, please join me in thanking the New South Wales Treasurer, Dominic Perrottet, Jane Holton and David Sadie.